Hey, Ryan Reynolds here. Wishing you a very happy half-off holiday because right now Mint Mobile is offering you the gift of 50% off unlimited. To be clear, that's half price, not half the service. And Mint is still premium unlimited wireless for a great price. So that means a half day. Yeah? Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Hey friends, it's Nikayla from the podcast Side Hustle Pro. I'm always looking for ways to keep my kids entertained without screens, and the Yoto Mini has been a total lifesaver. My kids are obsessed. Yoto is a screen-free audio player where kids just pop in a card and listen. Hours of stories, music, podcasts, and more, and no screens or ads. With hundreds of options for ages 0 to 12, it's the perfect gift they'll go back to again and again. Check it out at yotoplay.com. YOTOPLAY.com.
Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And I want to talk today about what it is people thought in the late 1930s about the possibility of aerial warfare, about war from the skies, because this occupies a huge amount of mental energy and anxiety and worry amongst all the combatant powers. I mean, obviously, Germany um, intends to wage its war by via blitzkrieg, and the British and the Americans who were obviously who joined the war later, but have a kind of strategic vision of air war during the 1930s. They also have a vision of what aerial combat looks like, and the extent to which it would be a war against civilians. I mean, perhaps this is unknown in 1938-39, but subsequent histories obviously point out that the majority of the victims of the Second World War are civilian, and many of those who died are people killed by mass aerial bombing. So we're diving into the bombing war by Richard Overy, and he begins by talking. This is in Chapter 5, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, Bomber Command, 1939 to 42. And he begins by talking about Roosevelt's kind of bombing diplomacy. On the 1st of September 1939, President Roosevelt sent an appeal to all the major European powers involved in the crisis over Poland to give a public undertaking that they would abstain from any air attacks against civilians or unfortified cities. The same day, Hitler told the American charge d'affaires in Berlin that this had always been his preference and assured Roosevelt that German aircraft would only attack military objectives. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, gave his guarantee on the same day. A joint Anglo-French declaration followed on the 3rd of September, only reserving the right to act as they saw fit if the enemy failed to observe the same restrictions. The Polish ambassador in Washington, whose country was already at war, agreed that Polish pilots would be told not to bomb open cities as long as the enemy did the same. None of these expressions of goodwill was legally binding in international law. The idea that bombing warfare could somehow be humanised had been explored by a British committee set up in July 1938 with the cumbersome title Limitation of Armaments Committee, Subcommittee on the Humanisation of Aerial Warfare. I mean, a lot of this is acutely naive and unworkable and unlikely, and various air campaigns throughout the 1930s in Spain, in Abyssinia, and in China had already shown that the aircraft was a tool for attacking civilian targets and would continue to be used in that way. The discussions of the committee, chaired by Sir William Malkin, went round in circles. The terms for a possible international agreement on limiting bombing to military objectives suffered not only from the realistic objection that such terms would be unenforceable in a real war, but from the difficulty of defining what was meant by a military objective. In the end, the committee proved more useful in giving the Air Ministry the opportunity to defend the idea that bombing arms factories and armaments workers was as legitimate as a naval blockade, than it was in finding grounds for a diplomatic solution. And bear in mind that the British naval blockade of Germany in the First World War had led to enormous civilian suffering. Not to suggest that the German naval blockade of Britain hadn't led to hardship, but it was not on a scale, that we can kind of compare really in terms of hardship and famine by the end of the war. In the absence of international agreement, the RAF was told to abide by the Hague Rules for Air Warfare, first drafted in 1923 but never ratified, but to do so only as long as the enemy did the same. The rules were spelt out in a cabinet decision and repeated regularly up to and beyond the outbreak of the war. Intentional bombing of civilians was illegal. Only identifiable military objectives could be attacked from the air, and any such attack must be undertaken without negligent harm to civilians. In August 1939, the Air Ministry concluded that attacks on targets difficult to identify through cloud or at night would also be illegal, as would any operation in which the civilian population, hospitals, cultural monuments, or historic sites were all targeted. And if we look at what the combined bombing offensive does by the end of the war, of course, it destroys in Germany all of those things. An interdepartmental committee set up the same month to draft detailed instructions on the rules of engagement for British Armed Forces stipulated that it is clearly illegal to bombard a populated area in the hope of hitting a legitimate target. These legal limitations reflected decisions taken in military staff talks between the British and the French high commands in the spring of 1939 as they planned for a possible war. In April, the two military staffs had agreed only to attack military targets in the narrowest sense of the term, at sea or on the fighting front. British bombers were to be used to help the battle on land, not to attack distant targets in Germany. The French were insistent that the RAF should not attack German cities, while the balance of air resources was so obviously favoured Germany, and French industry was not yet adequately protected. A few days before the outbreak of war, British Chief of the Air Staff Sir Cyril Newall warned Air Chief Marshal Edgar Ludlow Hewitt, Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, that his activities were bound to be restricted for political reasons. though Ludlow Hewitt knew that Bomber Command's small size and operational difficulties were enough on their own to inhibit offensive action, so it wasn't that much of a big deal. Newell worried that even if the RAF bombed legitimate objectives, the Germans would claim that they had killed civilians. There was a strong political pressure to ensure that all democracies were not seen to violate the bombing prescription first. It was decided in October 1939 that only if German aircraft started to kill large numbers of civilians from the air, promiscuous bombardment as it was called, would the RAF take the gloves off. It's interesting to look at, I'm not going to call it naivety, but to look at the positions that are taken in 1939 and to draw conclusions there about what it is, the nature of the war that people thought was going to come, and the ferocity and the brutality of the war, and the kind of the scope and the scale of the war, and the length of the war, perhaps was impossible at that moment to predict, and maybe even if there were beliefs about the kind of war that was going to come, it shows you the kind of the robustness of liberalism at the time. The idea that there are rules, checks and balances, and international law, and things you definitely don't do. And it also shows you what happens by the end of the war to some of those values, some of those ideas, and the kind of the distance travelled between these kinds of starting points all the way through to the horrors of bombing like Dresden. And Dresden was, just one of many cities, Hamburg, Cologne, Bremen, other cities devastated and deliberately and willfully devastated by aerial bombing, particularly Hamburg and Cologne, designed really to kind of be wiped off the face of the earth as a kind of a bid to sort of break the German populace. But we're getting ahead of ourselves there. We haven't even kind of introduced Bomber Harris yet, but he'll no doubt be part of the story as we go on. Both sides at first stuck to their pledge not to attack targets in each of the cities where civilians were at risk, though this did not prevent the German Air Force from killing non-combatants during its operations in Poland. Chamberlain had no interest in provoking German bombing of British towns, despite appeals from the Polish government in early September to begin bombing Germany as a gesture of assistance. It was nonetheless the case that for the first months of the war, Bomber Command strained at the leash to be able to do what years of planning had prepared it for. A half-hearted agreement was reached with the French High Command to initiate bombing of the German Ruhr Rhineland industrial region, usually capitalized in British documents as the Ruhr. If a sudden German attack was threatened Belgium or menaced Franco-British forces decisively, but the French remained cautious about risking retaliation, even during their invasion of May 1940. In the end, it was the British who ended the international embargo agreed in September. On the night of the 11th and 12th of May, 2 days after the German invasion in Western Europe, 37 medium and light bombers attacked industrial and transport targets in the Rhineland city of Munich Gladbach, killing 4 people, including an Englishwoman who happened to live there. British raids were to continue throughout the war. The last was made on the 3rd of May 1945 on the northern German port of Kiel, just 36 hours before Allied troops occupied the city.
AI is transforming customer service. It's real and it works. And with Finn, we've built the #1 AI agent for customer service. We're seeing lots of cases where it's solving up to 90% of real queries for real businesses. This includes the real-world complex stuff like issuing a refund or cancelling an order. And we also see it when Finn goes up against competitors. It's top of all the performance benchmarks, top of the G2 leaderboard, and if you're not happy, we'll refund you up to $1 million, which I think says it all. Check it out for yourself at fin.ai.
Hey, Ryan Reynolds here. Wishing you a very happy half-off holiday because right now Mint Mobile is offering you the gift of 50% off unlimited. To be clear, that's half price, not half the service. Like, Mint is still premium unlimited wireless for a great price. So that means a half day, yeah? Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Avoiding your unfinished home projects because you're not sure where to start? Thumbtack knows home so you don't have to. Don't know the difference between matte paint finish and satin? Or what that clunking sound from your dryer is? With Thumbtack, you don't have to be a home pro. You just have to hire one. You can hire top-rated pros, see price estimates, and read reviews all on the app. Download today.
So a lot of this comes down to British political culture at the time and the idea that the British Empire is this sort of source of civilization against barbarism. During the 1930s, again, another one of Richard Overy's books, The Morbid Age, the fixation with the idea of war, the idea of civilization and its defense, and the idea that whatever else Nazism or Italian fascism or Japanese imperialism were, they were the rising challengers to civilization. These people were kind of like barbarians beyond the gates. And there are certain things within, within civilization that you don't do. That the targeting of civilians is something that renders renders your kind of civilization defunct. It is how you kind of allow the enemy to win by essentially emulating them. Now, this is all noble stuff, and it's not to kind of ignore the realities of the British Empire, which for many of its colonial subjects is extremely uncivilized. However, what I think is important here is how quickly this fades away. The moment that total war is upon us, and the imperatives of bombing as a possible solution, and what bombing represents to Britain's political classes and to much of civil society, is this is an alternative to the horrors of the trenches. If a war can be won from the air, it can be won more quickly and cleanly, and by taking the fight directly to the enemy. And this can prevent the horrors of the trenches of the First World War, which has such a kind of a resonance. I mean, it has a resonance over all combative powers, but particularly over the British. Looking at it from this perspective, we have no kind of monopoly on historical memory or grief here. So, Richard Overy writes, the political and legal restrictions imposed on Bomber Command were consistent with the widely held view in Britain that indiscriminate bombing was the hallmark of barbarism, whereas self-restraint was a feature of being civilized. Yet there was also a powerful and prudential argument for not undertaking bombing from the start of the war, as the French realized. In the autumn of 1939, Bomber Command was not yet ready to launch any major offensive campaign. For all the talk in the 1930s of developing a strike force capable of taking the fight directly into the enemy heartland, progress in developing the technology of aircraft, bombs, bomb sites, and navigation aids have been painfully slow. One of Chamberlain's more desperate acts before the war was to ask Roosevelt on the 25th of August 1939, a week before his appeal, to supply American northern bomb site for British use. Roosevelt declined, not because it would compromise his subsequent appeal to abstain from bombing, but because agreeing to this request would make it seem that the United States had taken sides in the conflict. At the outbreak of the war, Ludlow Hewitt was well aware of the deficiencies of his force, which had already been exposed when the Air Ministry at last began in 1938 to consider the practicalities of long-range bombing. The gap between ambition and reality was remarkably wide for a force committed to a bombing strategy, a reflection of the poor technical experience of much of the RAF leadership and the failure to define doctrine clearly.
Hey, Ryan Reynolds here, wishing you a very happy half-off holiday because right now Mint Mobile is offering you the gift of 50% off unlimited. To be clear, that's half price, not half the service. Like, Mint is still premium unlimited wireless for a great price. So that means a half day, yeah?
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Hey friends, it's Nikayla from the podcast Side Hustle Pro. I'm always looking for ways to keep my kids entertained without screens, and the Yoto Mini has been a total lifesaver. My kids are obsessed. Yoto is a screen-free audio player where kids just pop in a card and listen. Hours of stories, music, podcasts, and more, and no screens or ads. With hundreds of options for ages 0 to 12, it's the perfect gift they'll go back to again and again. Check it out at yotoplay.com. YOTOPLAY.com.
There were too few airfields capable of handling heavier aircraft, little experience in bombing training, a shortage of maps in northwest Germany, and a total of only 488 bombers of all kinds, including light bombers destined to form part of an advanced air striking force when it was sent to France in late 1939. Unrestricted air warfare, ran the Air Ministry instruction, is not in the interests of Great Britain. So Britain, more than anything else, isn't ready for the kind of mass bombing war that we see later on in 1939. And this is a kind of a crucial part of kind of British hesitation or uncertainty when it comes to mass aerial warfare. RAF Bomber Command dated from the reorganisation of the Air Arm in 1936. Unlike the German Air Force, all bomber units were grouped together under a single commander-in-chief based at Bomber Command headquarters near High Wycombe, northwest of London. This had important implications for the identity of the command because its sole function was to bomb. As a force, it was only offensive, and its main duty was to define what targets to bomb, to produce the technology to enable those targets to be destroyed, and to train the manpower to do it. This functional identity encouraged Bomber Command to construct a doctrine and a force independent of the Army and the Navy, capable of striking a potential enemy at what was perceived to be their most vulnerable point. The command was disinclined to accept the role of auxiliary to the requirements of surface forces, and there was almost no planning for army cooperation to match the German Air Force doctrine. So obviously, the German Air Force doctrine is really a part of Blitzkrieg. That the kind of the lighter bombers that the Luftwaffe had, and fighters worked in coordination with the army in order to achieve battlefield objectives. This is not what Bomber Command saw itself as, and it's hardly surprising that mass aerial bombing campaigns to firstly to wear down and degrade Germany's infrastructure and then to break civilian morale emerged from this philosophy. And it seems to be that the philosophy is almost the product of the organizational structure. If you hive off Bomber Command as its own entity, and you don't subordinate it to other branches of the armed forces, then unsurprisingly, it creates its own institutional culture. It has people that emerged, thinking that Bomber Command is and should be a separate entity and can be part of, and it as a service on its own can be the kind of strategic answer to winning the war. And this is where you get Sir Arthur Bomber Harris from. This mentality, and he says essentially, we're going to show you that this war can be won from the air, and it can be won through mass bombing. Right up to the outbreak of the war and beyond, the RAF argued that its contribution to the battlefield would be of little significance. Attacks on railway communications were regarded as difficult and ineffective, while raids against marching columns of men were deemed to be a waste of bombing resources. Instead, the Air Ministry drew up what were known as Western Air Plans, a series of 16 individual plans, some of which committed the bomber force to assist the Admiralty in the war at sea, but none of which committed the bombers to help the army in the field. Only 2 of the plans were seriously prepared for. WA4 involved long-range attacks against communication targets in Germany to slow up the German advance. WA5 was for air attacks on the German industrial economy, particularly the rural area and the German oil industry. An industrial intelligence centre, first established in 1931 under Desmond Morton, later Churchill's intelligence advisor, drew up lists of vulnerable targets in German industry. Most of them could not be hit from British bases with existing aircraft, but they formed the basis of the RAF insistence that the most efficient use of bomber aircraft was against the enemy home front, not its armed forces. Yet vulnerable targets on the home front could not be hit as long as the government insisted on the letter of the law. And there, we understand what gives. And we understand that the institutional culture of Bomber Command, the philosophy of Bomber Command, and the makeup of Bomber Command and its perceived role triumphs any sort of niceties that by 1940 no longer exist anyway about what it will take to win the war from the air. And it's these forces that collide with one another that then shape actual outcomes and what we see happening, and the nature of particular missions and the nature of the war itself. Anyway, I'm going to leave you there. I hope you found that enjoyable and interesting, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Take good care, everybody. All the best. Bye-bye.
Dreaming of getting the all-new iPhone 17 Pro designed to be the most powerful iPhone ever?
Then stay in bed and let a Boost Mobile expert deliver and set it up for you.
Oh, actually, they will have to get up and open the door.
Oh, right.
Delivery available for select devices purchased at boostmobile.com. Terms apply.
Hey friends, it's Nikayla from the podcast Side Hustle Pro. I'm always looking for ways to keep my kids entertained without screens, and the Yoto Mini has been a total lifesaver. My kids are obsessed. Yoto is a screen-free audio player where kids just pop in a card and listen. Hours of stories, music, podcasts, and more, and no screens or ads. With hundreds of options for ages 0 to 12, it's the perfect gift they'll go back to again and again. Check it out at yotoplay.com, YOTOPLAY.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.